We were once limitless. According to one of the oldest recorded accounts in existence, humanity was once so unified, so coordinated, so singular in will, that God himself looked down and felt the need to intervene, to stop us. This is that story. If you too are willful, check out Pantheon, our brand inspired by myths, legends, and folklore. We ship worldwide and are rated excellent on Trustpilot. Link in the description. What actually stops us from achieving something? It's worth thinking about seriously before answering, because the instinctive response is talent, money, opportunity. But it doesn't hold up under examination. Talent is distributed widely enough that it can't be the real ceiling. Money follows vision when the vision is compelling enough. Opportunity, at least in the modern world, has never been more accessible. The real barriers are simpler and older than any of those. Resources, time, knowledge, coordination. And here's what's remarkable. 3 of those 4 have been systematically dismantled across the human course of history. Resources. For most of our existence, what we could build was determined entirely by what existed within walking distance. Stone, wood, whatever the land offered. The Industrial Revolution changed that. Global trade changed it further. Today, raw materials move across the planet in days. The physical constraints that limited every civilization before the modern era have been reduced to logistics problems. Expensive ones, difficult ones, but solvable. Time. 1,000 years ago, knowledge moved at the speed of a human being on a horseback. The idea conceived in one part of the world might take decades to reach another. The printing press compressed that. The telegraph compressed it further. The internet made it instantaneous. But what once took generations now takes seconds. Barrier of time between an idea and its execution has collapsed in ways that would have been genuinely incomprehensible to any of us alive 2 centuries ago. Knowledge. For most of history, what we knew was determined almost entirely by where we were born and who we happened to meet. Knowledge was local, fragile. It died with people who carried it. Libraries changed that. Universities changed it more. The digestion of human knowledge has made accumulated understanding of thousands of years of civilization available to anyone with a connection to the internet. The barrier between ignorance and understanding has never been lower. 3 barriers, reduced generation by generation, century by century. But the 4th one remains. Coordination. The ability of us to want the same thing. Communicate it without distortion, and act on it together without anything being lost between one mind and the next. That barrier has never fallen, and the more you examine history, the more you realize it's the barrier underneath all the others. Every civilization that collapsed, trace it back far enough and you'll find a coordination failure. Rome fell because it could no longer hold together the administrative, military, and political will of an empire too large and too fractured to move as one. Every war that didn't need to happen began with a mistranslation, a miscommunication, a moment where 2 parties needed to share one understanding and the gap between them was just wide enough to let catastrophe through. Every vision that failed, every movement that fractured, every project that never got finished, somewhere in the wreckage, you'll find the same thing. People who needed to be one mind and weren't. This is the ceiling we have never broken through, the last barrier standing after everything else came down, which makes one question unavoidable. What would we be actually capable of if it fell? If we genuinely shared one language, one understanding of reality, one direction of will, one model of the world with nothing lost between intention and execution? One mind. What would that look like? And more importantly, has it ever happened before? There is a text that has shaped the course of human civilization more than any other ever written. Whatever your relationship to it, the Bible is one of the oldest and most studied texts in human history. It's been translated into more languages than any other book, influenced more legal systems, more art, philosophy, war, architecture, music than any document before or since. Billions of people across thousands of years have structured their entire understanding of existence around what it contains. It is also a book that most people have never actually read. They know the stories, the Ark, the Exodus, the crucifixion, but knowing the shape of something and reading it carefully are two entirely different things. Buried within it, 11 verses long, is one of the most debated passages in the entire text. It takes 2 minutes to read. Scholars have spent careers on it. Theologians have argued over it for centuries, and almost everyone who has heard of it thinks they already know what it says. After a great flood that the text frames as a fundamental reset of humanity, the survivors and their descendants spread across the earth. At some point in that migration, all of us are in one place, one language, one people. We decided to build a city and a tower. God comes down, sees what we're doing, confuses our language, and scatters us across the earth. The city is abandoned. The tower goes unfinished. That is the story as most people know it. Arrogance, punishment. A lesson about knowing your place. But that version is missing almost everything that matters. The story of Babel that most people carry has passed through thousands of years, hundreds of languages, countless retellings, and somewhere in all of that travelling, something got lost. It's in the details. The text begins before the city, before the tower, before any decision is made. It establishes something about the condition of humanity at that moment. We were already moving as one, a single understanding of the world, and out of that unity, a decision emerges. Come, let us build. A collective voice, people moving together toward a shared vision. The Hebrew carries none of the arrogance or defiance that centuries of retelling laid into it. It reads like the most natural thing in the world. A unified people identifying what they want and moving toward it. The tower itself has been misread for just as long. Reaching toward the heavens sounds like overreach, like humanity trying to place itself above God. But in the ancient Near East, towers were structures built to connect earth to the divine, to participate in something larger than the purely human. The ambition wasn't to overthrow anything, but to reach toward something. The text says God came down to see what was being built. Descended, as if whatever was happening required closer inspection than distance could provide. As if the scale of what was becoming possible warranted that response. Then God speaks, and what gets said in that moment is the sentence that changes everything. Nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Sit with that. This is the text putting those words in God's mouth. The being with complete knowledge, looking at what we had become in our unity, in our shared language, in our singular direction of will, and reaching a conclusion. We had arrived at a threshold. Whatever we turned our collective invention toward, we would achieve. The ceiling was gone. Nothing we planned to do would be impossible for us. And then, in almost the same breath, it ends. Our language is confused. We scatter. The city is left behind. The tower stands unfinished and untouched. What's remarkable is how little actually happens in that moment. The city remains standing, the tower remains standing. We simply leave. One thing and one thing only has changed. And that single change was enough to dissolve everything else completely. The text records no sin, no anger, no destruction, no stated reason. The response has the quality of something that understood exactly which thread to pull and pulled only that one. And then the account ends. 11 verses, 2 minutes of reading. With the most important question it raises left entirely unanswered. Why? Nimrod. Genesis gives him almost nothing, and yet he is central to this story. In the verses surrounding the Babel account, a name appears briefly. A man described as a mighty hunter, a kingdom builder, someone whose rule extended across the earliest cities of that world. The text gives him a handful of lines and moves on. But the traditions that came after were remarkably unwilling to let him go. Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, describes him in detail that Genesis never provides. A man of extraordinary ambition who convinced the people around him that their prosperity came from their own strength rather than any divine source. who used that conviction to consolidate power, who proposed the tower as an act of defiance rather than worship, a statement that humanity owed nothing to God and could secure its own future. Josephus frames him as the architect of the entire project, the will behind it. Islam takes it further. Here Nimrod is a king who declared himself divine, who demanded to be worshipped, who, when told of a god above him, reportedly launched a military campaign against the heavens themselves, sending soldiers skyward on the backs of enormous birds, returning with arrows stained red to convince his people that God was dead. A man so consumed by the need to be the ceiling that he went to war with the idea of anything above him. The Book of Jasher, an ancient text referenced within the Bible, though debated by scholars, describes something stranger still. Nimrod in possession of the garments of Adam. The original clothes that God made for the first human being. Whoever wore them held a kind of authority over the natural world. Animals submitted, people followed. His power was something older than politics. Every one of these traditions disagrees on the details. The specifics shift depending on who is writing, when they are writing, and what they are trying to explain. But underneath all of it, every single one is reaching toward the same thing. They are all trying to account for the scale of what happened at Babel, for the fact that this moment required a response at the highest level, and they all arrive at the same conclusion, that what was building there wasn't spontaneous. It was directed, concentrated, the product of a unified human will with someone extraordinary at the center of it. What's worth noticing is that none of these accounts are really arguing about man. They are arguing about the moment, about what we became, about what it was that made God look down. Nimrod is the lens every tradition reaches for when trying to understand the same unanswerable question. What exactly were we becoming? Of everything that God could have taken, the city, the tower, the knowledge, the leadership, what was chosen was language. It's worth asking why. Think about the last time you tried to explain something you couldn't quite reach. A feeling that existed perfectly inside you and dissolved the moment you opened your mouth. A vision, an idea, something you understood completely in the privacy of your own mind that came out wrong the moment it met words. Something was lost, and that was just you trying to communicate with yourself. Now multiply that across every human interaction that has ever happened, every relationship, every collaboration, every attempt to build something together. Every moment where what was meant and what was received were separated by just enough distance to change everything. That gap between intention and understanding is the friction that has defined the entire human story. Language is how we close it, or try to. But here's what makes language stranger and more significant than most people realize. It isn't just a tool for communicating reality. Research suggests it actually constructs it. The language you think in shapes the thoughts you're capable of having. People who speak different languages don't just describe the world differently. They perceive it differently. Studies have shown that speakers of different languages experience time differently, categorize color differently, understand the relationship between cause and effect differently. The structure of your language is part of how you see the world. This is what linguists called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. The idea that language and thought are so deeply intertwined that the words available to you determine, at least in part, the reality available to you. Now, take that and scale it up. One shared language across an entire species means one shared model of reality. One way of understanding time, causality, value, possibility. Every mind on Earth operating within the same cognitive architecture, the same categories, the same conceptual vocabulary, the same way of making sense of what is and isn't possible, is something closer to collective consciousness. One organism, one will, every individual mind in a node, in something larger than any of them separately. And now the choice makes sense. Of everything that could have been taken, language was the one thing that couldn't be rebuilt, rediscovered, or replaced by new leadership. Tools can be remade, knowledge resurfaces, leaders emerge. But a shared architecture of reality, once fractured, has never been reconstructed. Language wasn't incidental to what was taken at Babel. It was the target, the single precise removal that guaranteed everything else would follow. The one thread that, pulled, unravels the whole. What was taken was the ability to think as one. Most people who engage with Babel get pulled toward the most obvious questions. Was it arrogance? Was there a sin the text isn't telling us about? Was God threatened by what we were building? Those are reasonable questions, but they all share the same assumption, that the intervention was a response to something wrong. Why then? The text is precise about the timing. God doesn't intervene when the idea is first conceived, doesn't act when the foundations are being laid, it doesn't respond when the project is in its early stages and the outcome is still uncertain. God intervenes when it's working, when the city is rising, when the tower is taking shape, when the unified will of an entire species is producing exactly the result it set out to produce. The intervention arrives at the moment of success. Sit with that for a moment, because it runs counter to almost everything else in the text. The Bible never hides its reasons for major interventions. When God sends the flood, the text is explicit. Humanity had become so corrupted and saturated with violence and wickedness that the scale of the moral failure is described in detail before a single drop of rain falls. The reason is stated. Sodom is the same. Before the city is destroyed, the text goes into considerable lengths to establish what was happening there. Angels are sent to investigate. The nature of the sin is documented. The intervention arrives only after the case has been made. Even Eden follows this logic. There is a specific tree, a specific instruction, a specific moment of disobedience that the text identifies with precision before the consequences unfold. The reason is never in doubt. Every major intervention in the text has a because. Babel has none. The text moves directly from the acknowledge of what we were becoming to the act of intervention. No justification is offered. Thinkers across centuries have tried to fill the gap. Augustine, writing in the 5th century, argued that Babel was ultimately about pride. The same pride that drove the fall of Lucifer, the same pride that reaches for what belongs to God alone. It was a reading that gave the intervention a moral logic. If pride was the sin, the scattering was the consequence. But even Augustine couldn't fully resolve the problem the text presents. The pride he identifies isn't named in the passage. He brings it in. He reads it into the silence, and the question of why that silence exists in the first place remains untouched. John Calvin, writing in the 16th century, approached it differently. For Calvin, the intervention was protection. God, seeing where unlimited human ambition inevitably leads, the corruption, the tyranny, the violence that concentrates wherever unchecked power accumulates, acted to prevent something worse than the scattering itself. The fragmentation was mercy, a circuit breaker pulled before the system destroyed itself. Calvin's reading is compelling, but it carries its own difficulty. If the scattering was protection, what exactly were we being protected from, and why does the text not say so? Jacques Derrida, the 12th century philosopher, took the question somewhere else entirely. In his essay, Détours de Babel, he argued that the tower represented something more fundamental than physical ambition. It was an attempt to establish a single human authority over language, over the power to name things, to define reality, to determine what words meant and therefore what the world means. In Derrida's reading, the intervention was about who would control meaning, and the scattering of language was a reassertion of divine authority over the very architecture of thought. 3 serious thinkers, separated by 15 centuries. 3 entirely different answers to the same question. None of them agree on what happened or why none of them can fully account for the timing. Which means the question is exactly where the text left it. What was the other side of that threshold? What were we about to become in that moment of perfect unity and limitless potential that required interruption before we arrived there? The text doesn't tell us, and that silence is the most important thing about this story. Because how you answer it, or whether you believe it can be answered at all, determines everything about what Babel actually means. So what are the options? The silence the text leaves isn't accidental. It is a gap that demands to be stood in, and once you stand in it, honestly, only two serious positions emerge. The first is control, a being protecting a position, humanity approaching a ceiling that existed for a reason. It was boundary enforcement, a limit placing our potential. What makes this reading uncomfortable is what it implies about the nature of intervention. If God acted to limit us at the moment of our greatest capability, then what was being protected, and from whom? The text presents a being with complete knowledge looking at what we were becoming and choosing, in that moment, to ensure we stayed something less. It's the language of power wanting to remain in power. The second position is protection. Something with longer sight than us, looking at where unlimited human potential leads, and made a calculation. A species with no ceiling and no friction between intention and execution, in a world where the full weight of human ambition could be applied without limit. Perhaps the scattering wasn't a cage. Perhaps it's what God saw on the other side of the threshold was humanity's destruction. And the fragmentation of language was the minimum intervention required to prevent something we wouldn't have survived. Both readings are serious, both are internally consistent, both are supported by text without being demanded by it. That isn't a flaw in the story. That is the story. The answer you arrive at determines what you think about the relationship between human potential and divine authority, about whether the ceiling above us exists for our benefit or for someone else's, about whether the friction that has kept us apart since that moment is a wound or a mercy. We're not told which. And perhaps that itself is the answer. Rather than question what happened at Babel, perhaps we should question what kind of universe we are living in. One where the ceiling was placed there to protect us, or one where it was placed there to keep us down. Everything discussed so far could be dismissed as ancient history, a story from a text thousands of years old, interpreted, reinterpreted, and argued over by philosophers and theologians across centuries. But the pattern it describes is not ancient. On the 24th of October 1945, in the immediate aftermath of the deadliest conflict in human history, a new institution came into existence. 50 nations signed its charter. The stated purpose was simple: to prevent what had just happened from ever happening again. To create a framework where the nations of the world could resolve their differences without violence. To establish, for the first time in history, a permanent structure for global cooperation. The United Nations. What preceded it had been almost incomprehensible in scale. 70 to 85 million people dead. Entire cities reduced to ash. The systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others in an act the world had watched and largely failed to stop. By the time it ended, the survivors, the politicians, diplomats, the ordinary people who had lived through it, shared something that no generation before them had shared in quite the same way. The knowledge of exactly what human division costs. And out of that knowledge came something remarkable. A genuine, sincere, broadly shared belief that humanity had finally suffered enough to choose differently. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, was described by Eleanor Roosevelt, who chaired the committee that drafted it, as a common standard of achievement for all peoples and all nations. For the first time in history, the world had agreed on something, on a set of values that belonged to every human being simply by virtue of being human. It felt, to the people inside it, like the beginning of something new. Within years, the cracks were visible. The Cold War divided the Security Council into a permanent arena for superpower rivalry. The veto system, designed to ensure major powers stayed within the institution, became the mechanism by which they paralyzed it. Wars continued, as did mass killings. The body built to prevent the worst human behavior watched it happen repeatedly and found itself unable to respond. The thing built to unify became another arena for the same divisions it was designed to dissolve. The unity had lasted barely long enough before the scatter began. And if that feels too distant, too historical to carry personal weight, consider what happened to the internet. In the 1990s, there was a genuine, widespread belief that a global network connecting every human mind would dissolve the barriers that had always kept us apart. That access to the same information, the same conversations, the same shared space of ideas would create understanding across cultures, languages, ideologies, that the friction would finally fall. What followed was the most sophisticated system for human division ever constructed. Algorithms learned to separate us into communities of shared outrage. Information ecosystems so fragmented that people occupying the same physical space began inhabiting entirely different realities. A tool built for connection became the primary infrastructure for disconnection. The pattern is the same. The unity forms, the potential becomes visible, and then something, human nature, systemic failure, the weight of our own divisions, pulls it apart before it can become what it promised to be. You don't need to believe in God to see it. The label changes every time. The pattern doesn't. The story was never really about a tower. Towers can be built again. Cities can be rebuilt. Civilizations can rise and fall and leave their ruins for the next one to build on. What was taken at Babel was something else entirely, the ability to be one mind, one will, one species moving without friction toward whatever we collectively decided was worth reaching for. That had never existed before that moment, and in the thousands of years since, through every empire, every revolution, every attempt to unite under one vision, it has never existed again. We have been reaching for it ever since, without knowing that's what we were reaching for. Every structure we build to bring us together becomes an arena for the forces that pull us apart. Every common language we find develops dialects. Every shared vision fractures along the lines of who benefits and who doesn't. The pattern is so consistent, so precise in its repetition across every era and every culture that it stops feeling like a coincidence. It starts feeling like a design. And that is the question that Babel leaves you with. Not whether God exists, not whether the story is literal or metaphorical, not whether the tower was real, but whether the distance between us is accidental or intentional. Because if it's intentional, if something looked at what we were becoming and made sure we didn't get there, then we are not a species that fell short. We are a species that was stopped. And we'll never understand why.